Welcome back, horror fans, cinephiles, and giallo enthusiasts. This is Tanner Leeser, your host for all things giallo here on The King in Giallo. Our next stop on our journey through giallo cinema is the second giallo film from Lucio Fulci, A Lizard in a Woman's Skin, released in 1971. In this video, I will do a deep dive overview, then segue into a full review and GialliTally. The overview will be spoiler-free, the review and GialliTally will not. Here is A Lizard in a Woman's Skin overview. A Lizard in a Woman's Skin is an Italian, Spanish, and French co-production. The film is directed by Lucio Fulci, who also co-wrote the film's script along with Robert Gianvitti, Jose Luis Martinez Mola, and Andre Tranche. The music is composed by Ennio Morricone, with orchestral direction by Bruno Nicolai. The cast is comprised of Florinda Bolkan as Carol Hammond, Stanley Baker as Inspector Corvin, John Sorrell as Frank Hammond, Leo Genn as Edmund Brighton, Alberto de Mendoza as Sergeant Brandon, Eddie Galliani, aka Ellie Galliani, or Justine Gall, billed as Eddie Gall, as Joan Hammond. Pick a name, girl. Sylvia Monti as Deborah, Anita Strindberg as Julia Durer, and Jorge Rigaud as Dr. Kerr. The plot follows Carol Hammond, the troubled daughter of a wealthy lawyer and aspiring politician, Edmund Brighton, whose husband works for her father's law practice. Carol has been plagued by terrifying psychedelic dreams and has sought help from a psychoanalyst, Dr. Kerr. Numerous of her dreams center around her neighbor, Julia Durer, a provocative hedonist who throws drug-fueled parties, whom Dr. Kerr believes must represent something of duplicitous nature within Carol. The strange dreams become reality after Carol envisions herself murdering Julia whilst being watched by two others, only for Julia to actually have been murdered. Scotland Yard gets involved to solve the crime, and Carol becomes the prime suspect, but her father is determined to prove her innocence. The plot thickens as adultery, blackmail, and murder arise. It might not come as a shock to fans and critics to learn that, according to people who knew Lucio Fulci, he harbored a distrust towards psychoanalysis, which is aided by the fact that he oftentimes, through his filmography, would bash the practice. This particular film happens to find the master at the zenith of his pull as a director, working with a larger budget than in subsequent films, and surrounded by a cadre of competent collaborators. Troy Howarth questions if Fulci could have continued to work at this scale through his career, if he would have been able to garner more respect from the film snobs and the cineastes versus the bloodthirsty gorehounds. I think Fulci's early work does prove that he was something of a genius, and despite also loving his later films, the gory ones mentioned, that he unfortunately does become relegated to just an exploitation director who likes sex and violence. What I find humorous about this film is how much it behaves like an Agatha Christie plot with Fulci directing. The investigation is very tedious and thorough, and if you are not paying close attention, you might get lost along the way. Similar to Perversion Story, Fulci clearly cares a lot about the structure of the mystery and the motivations driving all the parties involved in the tale. As he would go on to say, Fulci hated Dario Argento's thrillers for being sloppy in their construction, yet brilliant in their execution. Despite all his work, Fulci would reflect on his own thrillers as being too mechanical in their structure. Honestly, my opinion of this is yes and yes. I love Argento, but I feel he's entirely a visual artist and works best when he has someone else writing the scripts. Fulci does have brilliantly crafted narratives, but they sometimes can feel a bit much. If you believe a mystery should not be beholden to the trappings of logic, then you might find Fulci a bit boring. However, Fulci allows himself to go to amazing places within his thrillers, this one in particular, as he uses the hallucinogenic dreams as his excuse to indulge in some truly awe-inspiring dream sequences with fantastical elements. Fulci demonstrates a masterful comprehension and understanding of the material with his usage of camera technique and frame composition coupled with evocative editing. The result is one of Fulci's best directed films, one of the more stylish giallo films of this golden age era, and one of the most imaginative LSD fever dreams in cinema. The film deals with plenty of warring elements. The real versus the imagined as seen in the dreams, the ensuing murder and the psychoanalysis evaluations, the repressed versus the uninhibited, which drives the conflict in the beginning as through Carol's sessions with Dr. Care, we are able to discern that she might be at odds with herself. Is Carol truly disgusted and mortified by her neighbor's lifestyle? Or is she disturbed because of her own desires to indulge in such activities, and the shame of this reality causes her to seek professional help because of her position in high society? In the dreams with Julia, there are strong lesbian implications, suggesting by her doctor that Carol might be repressing a side of herself, and the violence in her one dream is a metaphor for her trying to kill that side of herself. As the plot unfolds, however, we the viewers start to question whether the obvious reveal of Carol being the killer might not actually be the convenient frame job from a blackmailer who has been hovering outside the action. Fulci walks a tightrope in this film of remaining coherent and logical while always keeping his eye on the natural conclusion of the story, but also allowing himself through the narrative to indulge in imaginative and experimental sequences, thanks to the employment of dreams and hallucinations. Playing within this caveat he has created for himself, Fulci is able to play Argento's game without sacrificing the integrity of the plot, and the final product brings us some of the most brutally graphic and imagined instances seen in Italian horror of this time, paired with some very realistic and relatable fears and pains which elicit a visceral reaction from all. Everything foreshadows the career Fulci would go on to weave, and the legacy he would leave on Italian horror and horror in general, but here, the madness is more reined in and focused. Fulci detractors might say his later films make no sense, but this criticism cannot be made here. The movie does everything in its power to weave in surreal elements while still finding its way to a realistic and logical conclusion, even if that means the ending is not as action-packed or spectacle-driven as some of his competitors within the genre. Fulci proves that he was beholden to the types of detective stories that inspired him, and the mystery and its conclusion are more important to him than a throwaway moment of pulling the rug out from under the audience. Fulci's collaborators on this film are all putting their best foot forward. The sets and art direction on display reflect the extravagant production value. The lighting intensifies the dreamlike atmosphere. The camera work from Mario Bava's longtime camera operator, Ubaldo Terzano, oscillates between balanced and well-composed, and unsettling and jarring when it is necessary to the telling. The special effects by Carlo Rambaldi were in fact so convincing that a particular scene involving eviscerated dogs was believed to be real, and Lucio Fulci was brought up on animal cruelty charges and jailed, and thus was only released when Rambaldi was able to produce the prop dogs he had used. Ennio Morricone's score is another one-of-a-kind soundtrack and adds to the off-putting state of mind of the character, and despite myself personally not loving the soundtrack through and through, I recognize the determination and creativity which spawned it. Florinda Balkan wonderfully embodies the unhinged Carol and does what she can to not let the performance slink into the dreaded one-dimensional territory. She would end up working with Fulci yet again in his third and next giallo film, Don't Torture a Duckling, 1972. Stanley Baker has the proud distinction of making an inspector in a giallo film both competent and likable through the usage of cynicism which never tips him over the edge into being unsympathetic. The Welsh actor was born in 1928 and entered films in the 1940s, where he quickly became associated as a sort of tough, rough-and-tumble type with roles in The Cruel Sea, 1953, Hell Drivers, 1957, and Violent Playground, 1958. Baker would do a series of films with director Joseph Losey, including The Criminal, 1960, Ava, 1962, and Accident, 1967. One of his biggest roles would be the 1964 epic Zulu. The fact that Baker would take on this Italian film role is a rather rare outing for him. Baker would go on to be knighted in 1976, months before he would succumb to lung cancer at the age of 48. Leo Genn plays Carol's successful father with a lot at stake. Genn was born in 1905 and would become a true veteran of British cinema in the 20th century. Some of his roles include Henry V, 1944 by Laurence Olivier, Green for Danger, 1946 by Sidney Gilliatt, and The Snake Pit, 1948 by Anatole Litvak. Genn was nominated for an Oscar for his performance in Quo Vadis, 1951, and by the 1960s, he would start to transition into genre films such as 10 Little Indians, 1965, and Circus of Fear, 1966, both by Harry Alan Towers, and The Bloody Judge, 1969, by Jus Franco. Giallo veterans in the flick include John Sorrell, famously in The Sweet Body of Deborah, 1968. Sylvia Monti would go on to be in The Fifth Chord later this year in 1971. Alberto de Mendoza, who was in Fulci's first giallo, Perversion Story, 1969, as well as the giallo which came out weeks prior to Lizard, The Strange Vice of Mrs. Ward, 1971. Jorge Rigaud, The Case of the Bloody Iris, 1972, and Eli Gialliani, seen in $5 for an August Moon, 1970. But I digress. On to the review. Spoilers ahead for those of you who haven't yet seen the film. You've been warned. My prediction for the movie's GialliTally score. At the time of writing this, I have already seen the film several times in the past decade and rewatched the movie recently for my Patreon viewing. I forgot to make a prediction in the video, but I will make that now. Let me say, there is a lot of nudity, and I will do my best to not count the same nude person in a scene twice. Anyways, I'll guess 550 to 600 points. Well, let's begin the GialliTally and review portion of the video, beginning as always with the previewing cliches. The repeat offenders are 1 point for actor, 3 for writer, 3 for composer, and 5 for director. Florinda Bolkan was in A Rather Complicated Girl, 1 point. John Sorrell was in A Quiet Place to Kill, Perversion Story, A Rather Complicated Girl, and The Sweet Body of Deborah, 4 points. I realize I forgot to add A Rather Complicated Girl for John Sorrell being in a previous movie, so I'll have to retroactively add that to some of the other GialliTally movies. Alberto de Mendoza was in The Strange Vice of Mrs. Ward, Perversion Story, and Psych Out for Murder, 3 points. Eli Gialliani was in $5 for an August Moon, 1 point. George Rigaud was in Perversion Story, 1 point. Ezio Marano was in Vergogna Schifosi, 1 point. Lucio Fulci wrote Perversion Story and Double Face, 6 points. Roberto Gianviti wrote Perversion Story, 3 points. Jose Luis Martinez Mola wrote Perversion Story, 3 points. Ennio Morricone composed for The Forbidden Photos of a Lady Above Suspicion, The Bird with the Crystal Plumage, Vergogna Schifosi, and A Quiet Place in the Country, 12 points. And finally, Lucio Fulci directed Perversion Story, 5 points. Cliche points for the title: a lizard in a woman's skin. Lizard and skin give us animal and body part, 10 points. First look, we have 25 points for the Italian director, an additional 15 points for the movie releasing during the golden age of giallo cinema, and 15 points for the influence bonus of this being a quintessential giallo film. And would you look at that, it is plot o'clock. My version of the DVD opens from American International, then segues into an opening credit sequence. The movie opens on a train. I'll give the movie close up on a door handle, 5 points. It's another one of those cliches that it will come up later, but why not do it now? This is Carol. She tries the doors, then pushes her way down the train, which becomes a crowded hallway. If you couldn't tell, she is dreaming. I want to say that there's a great deal of nudity in the movie, but if there's an ass hanging out in the background out of focus, I am not counting it. And you know, it's only that one. N is for nudity, 5 points. What a way to begin. Orgy scene, 7 points. Carol suddenly falls through a void. She comes face to face with this woman who suddenly appears before her naked, then clothed. The two women are on a giant bed. The woman approaches Carol, slips her coat off, and lies her down onto the bed. The woman begins putting the moves onto Carol. necking, 5 points. Queer characters, lesbian or bi, 5 points. I'm going to go out on a limb here and say oral, 7 points. Carol is having a really good dream. She awakens. Art featured, 5 points. Carol is writing as her stepdaughter Joan walks in. They banter on. Joan says she's going to take some of Carol's pills to study, but she's made breakfast, then offers to bring it up, but Carol says she'll be down at once. K is for knives, 5 points. A letter opener is a glorified knife, don't even get me started on that. We transition to Carol with Dr. Care at one of her psychoanalysis sessions. She has a microphone resting on her chest recording the session. Audio recording device, 5 points. Dr. Care works Carol through her confusion, reminding her that she's dreamt up this long corridor before, that it belongs to the flat adjoining hers, a real-world location she hasn't been to nor seen with her own eyes, and at the end of the corridor, she's always met by the same person, Julia Durer, her neighbor. In her dreams, Julia is always presented as a striptease artist or a prostitute, something representing degradation and vice to Carol. Dr. Care goes on to say that her interpretation of the flat next door is that it symbolizes vice. He points out that her anxiety is triggered by a conflict within her, in which she is both repulsed yet attracted to the behavior which she pins onto Julia, whom she admits that she finds corrupt. This fascination explains the recurrence of the same dreams over and over. We cut over to Julia's flat, where we see numerous hippies indulging in a drug-fueled, debaucherous party. Hippies, extra for drug use or dancing, 5 points. Gratuitous 1970s dancing, extra if naked, 5 points. Next door, we meet Jean Sorel as Frank, Carol's husband, and the father of Joan. This woman is Deborah, and this man is Edmund Brighton, Carol's father and her husband's boss. The two scenes cut back and forth. While they all seem bothered, Joan taps her foot to the beat of the music next door. The scene continues and spills over into the next one, where the characters are now in the living room as the party continues to rage on. Carol's father suggests that she should drink rather than spend all her allowance on psychoanalytic sessions. Exposition dumping, 2 points. On his way out, Edmund suggests that Frank ought to take Carol on a trip somewhere, that the change of scenery and pace could do her a world of good, but Frank states that Carol would have to go alone because Joan will be busy with exams, meanwhile he will have to look after the chambers while Edmund is preoccupied with the upcoming elections. Edmund nods and tells him to think it over. The next day, Edmund and Frank are discussing the course of action as Frank manages the practice while Edmund steps into politics. The phone rings. T is for telephone, 5 points. The caller is a Mrs. Smith, who seemingly is attempting to blackmail Edmund. He repeats aloud, "A member of my family?" Then looks to Frank, who looks away, suggesting he may be hiding something. The line goes blank. Frank goes to leave, but Edmund stops him and asks whether he is being unfaithful to Carol, which he deflects by asking, "You're joking, of course." Well, folks, what do you think? Is Jean Sorel's character carrying on an affair? The odds are pretty well stacked against any character he plays, I'll say. It is nighttime now, and a massive storm is raging on. We watch as Frank parks his car outside and goes in. And for those of you who voted yes, you are instantly rewarded as Frank begins carrying on an affair with Deborah. Who could have guessed? I is for infidelity, 5 points. Z is for Zoom, 5 points. We are in another dream of Carol's. Carol pushes on past a number of naked people. In the next sequence of the dream, Carol sees people she knows arranged in a ghoulish manner, mirroring the Francis Bacon painting Carol has above her bed. Add extra points for art for it being central to the plot, 5 points. Maybe it's not central, so to speak, but this warrants the extra points in my opinion. As she sees the gallery of garish figures, she notices the effigy of Joan is holding her own guts. Then suddenly, the dream changes once again to reflect another of Carol's paintings, the one with the giant swan. Carol is chased by this giant swan. The next sequence is back in the bedroom where we see a nude Julia approach Carol. Julia kneels before Carol and is about to undress her when Carol suddenly grabs the letter opener and repeatedly stabs Julia with it. Extra points for K is for knives for the blade getting bloodied, another 5 points. Extra points for N is for nudity for someone being nude during a murder, 5 points. Carol goes in for the kill. She finishes her attack and turns to find 2 hippie-looking figures staring down at her. W is for witness, 5 points. H is for hallucinations, extra if witness of a murder, 10 points. The dream cuts to Carol in another session with Dr. Kerr. He explains what the act of murder in her dream stands for. He says she killed the part of herself attracted to degradation and vice. He goes on to explain that the dream and all of its meaning, including the painting imagery, is tied to liberation. She asks about the hippies, and Dr. Kerr says the idea of witnesses is good as it demonstrates Carol's want for being exposed and not hiding anything back during her sessions, a degree of vulnerability and honesty, if you will. Carol jokingly asks whether she should make it up to Julia. The scene cuts to emergency vehicles, urban locales, 2 points, and foreign locales, London, 5 points. This is Inspector Corvin and Sergeant Brandon. They are investigating the real-world murder of Julia, whom they say was killed last Tuesday, judging by the body. They enter the crime scene. They find a syringe of heroin, illicit drug use, 5 points. The apartment is apparently riddled with drugs. Inspector Corvin tells his men to interrogate all the neighbors, but to be careful, as the daughter of Edmund Brighton is one of the residents. Sergeant Brandon is questioning Carol, Deborah, and Joan, asking them if they knew Julia Durer. Q is for questions, 5 points. Carol says they did not know her, and Joan says that they won't be of much help in solving this murder, prompting Sergeant Brandon to quip that he never said murder. Joan shows she's not an idiot, for why else would there be so many police over a slip-and-fall accident? Brandon looks to Carol, who tries to look away, as if she may be hiding something. Brandon asks if they remember anything from Monday night or Tuesday. Joan remarks about the storm and all the thunder. Carol looks haunted by this. She is asked whether she remembers anything, but she says she doesn't. He leaves, and once out of the room, Deborah asks Carol what is on her mind. Carol says Monday night was the night Frank left for Harborville. Frank is on the phone explaining that on Monday, his windshield wipers weren't working and he had to stop during his trip. Frank tells Edmund about the murder of Julia Durer, to which he says that he's not surprised. Frank tells him that Carol is very upset, and Edmund tells Frank that he should go to Carol. The next section of the movie is in Italian, as there was no English dub for these scenes. In the Italian dub, Joan tells her father that Carol has turned the entire flat upside down looking for her fur. Deborah adds that Mrs. Gordon had called and mentioned to Carol that Julia Durer was found strangled with a fur coat beside her. Over their meal, Carol confronts Frank for not bringing in the paper like he always does. Joan mentions that she had brought it in and misplaced it. Carol accuses them all of hiding something from her. The phone rings, and it is Mrs. Gordon calling again for Carol. She tells her that she was mistaken. Julia was not strangled, but stabbed 3 times. There's a weird bit where the woman is revealed to be sleeping with, I think, the chauffeur. Since this is all cut material, I won't be including them later in red herrings. Carol loses her mind trying to find the letter opener, which she confesses to Frank that she had used in her dream to murder Julia with. He attempts to calm her down. E is for eyeballs, 5 points. Cut to Frank being asked by the investigative team why he wants to see the body. He deflects by saying no reason other than that she was their neighbor. This reason was apparently the right answer. In another cut scene, we watch as the stress continues to grip Carol. Extra points for Z is for zoom for a zoom on eyes. Another 5 points. Carol goes out. At the crime scene, photos are heard being taken. Extra points for Z is for zoom for a zoom on a weapon. Another 5 points. After looking around for a little, Corvin questions Frank about the particulars, whether the fur coat is familiar. Carol follows Brandon in and seems petrified by the crime scene. Get a medic over here, she's still breathing. Carol has a flashback when she notices the same balcony from her dream. Carol then faints.
Brandon! Carol! Think she enjoys it here? Carol!
Y is for yelling, 5 points. Edmund and Frank are out talking about the similarities between the murder and Carol's dream. Edmund believes an explanation must exist. He wonders if someone is trying to drive Carol mad. Frank mostly scoffs at this idea. Edmund says if Carol were not his daughter, he'd dismiss the whole thing. Corvin is speaking with his boss now, Commissioner McLeod, who presses him to keep looking and to keep on his interrogations. Corvin eases him by stating the neighbors are all talking. That's not the issue. Plus, they have a remarkable amount of fingerprints at the crime scene, and Corvin believes wholeheartedly that the killer is a woman, for the coat did not belong to the victim. McLeod rebuts this and states that the boots weren't recognized either, but Corvin says because those were new based on the soles. At this instant, McLeod receives a call, which assuages his stress. He gets up and tells Corvin to come along with him. Their killer is a man. They walk into an interrogation room where a Harry Smith, a red-headed Irishman, is being held. Corvin asks whether they have his fingerprints, which they do not, only his confession. McLeod sits down to question Harry. He says he did it to avenge his brother George, but Corvin demands he give facts first. He says she was wearing a coat and boots when he did it. Corvin asks about the white scarf, but Harry denies this. He says he confronted her and stabbed her. McLeod asks if it was the paper knife, but Harry denies this, saying he only did that to confuse the police. He had used his brother's dagger. The room turns against him as they believe he is mad. He calls them out and produces a glass vial he claims contains Julia's guts. They take it to find out if he's lying and pull him out of the room. Corvin tells the policeman who brought Harry in that he will be working for archives now. F is for fashion, 5 points. While out on the town, Carol notices the hippies from her dream and has a flashback. I'll give mirror being used beyond its natural purpose for the usage in these two shots. 2 points. Joan and Carol follow the hippies across town on the bus. Extra points for W is for witness, for the witnesses being stalked afterwards. 5 points. They are led into an abandoned theater, which looks a little familiar. Sensing Carol's apprehension, Joan goes down to question the hippies. They shoo her away after a few moments. Joan tells Carol to perish the thought that she can't keep going off of her silly dream nonsense. They don't recognize Carol, and she must have seen them coming in or going out of Julia's flat since they were regulars there. Joan is uncertain whether the hippies knew Julia personally, but their conversation is then interrupted by this man who knows Joan. Lowell of the scientific squad is showing crime scene photos to the team. He tells Corvin that wet feet or wet soles of a shoe will always leave prints, no matter how thoroughly they were wiped off beforehand. Corvin remarks that it was raining that night, so if the killer came in from outside, they would have undoubtedly left their prints at the crime scene. Lowell shows Corvin an overhead photo showing footprints at the scene. Odd clue, 5 points. Lowell tells Corvin that the prints around the bed are not from wet prints, which implies those who came from outside that night are not the killer, and that the killer must have come from inside the building, i.e., a neighbor. Sergeant Brandon returns to his inquiry. Brandon hands out photographs of a man to all the residents, asking if they recognize him. They don't recognize him at all. It is revealed that this was a brilliant ploy to get the fingerprints of all the residents. Bravo. The scientific squad is able to find a match to the fingerprints on the knife with one of the residents who handled the photographs. Carol Hammond. Carol is arrested. The next scene has Carol speaking with her father across glass. He tells her to forget that he's a lawyer. He only wants to help her get out of this mess by telling him the truth. She says she didn't kill Julia. Cut to Edmund leading his daughter out. The camera drifts over to Corvin and Brandon watching as they go, who remark that when a judge grants bail to a figure that high, that you can't have doubts about the verdict. Corvin laments that because of Edmund's position, that he is in a bind with the investigation. Brandon asks what about the evidence. Corvin essentially says exactly. He adds that Carol was seeing a psychoanalyst, to which Brandon remarks that they could go for an insanity defense. Corvin states that he is determined to find a logical motive for the murder. The tape from the session is being played for Frank and Edmund. Dr. Kerr says Carol didn't commit the murder. If anything, her ego did. Frank then relates a similar case where a man had gotten off because it was argued that he was in a state of madness, separate from his regular state of consciousness. Edmund agrees, split personality. Dr. Kerr says that at the time of this session, he was convinced the confession was just a dream, and Edmund states that Carol still believes it was a dream. Dr. Kerr mentions the hippies, and his suggestion prompts Edmund to declare that the hippies might be actual witnesses, not just figments of the dream. He asks why they haven't come forward if that's the case. Halfway through the movie, we pause to marvel at some beautiful cars. Smoking in bed, that's good. Frank mentions with Deborah that Carol is recouping her strength in a clinic. She asks him how Carol became familiar with the Bartholomew case, the previous insanity defense. Frank says that she used to work in her father's law practice during that trial. Frank says that Edmund knew his daughter would make a great lawyer, and despite him thinking the Bartholomew case was hogwash, he recognized that it got the man off. The two get down and dirty, which doesn't go unnoticed. V is for voyeur, extra for it being an act of infidelity, 10 points. Aardvarking, 10 points. We don't really see it, but we hear it. Carol is at the sanatorium, reading. She notices a man spying on her from the bushes. When she looks back, he's gone. She runs away. And falls. She runs to the gate, but it is locked. She turns around and the man cuts her off. She tries the doors inside, but they are locked. She runs, and he chases her into the building. Foot chase, 5 points. Spiral staircase, extra if used in a chase, 7 points. All the doors she tries are locked. Carol hears the footsteps coming up the stairs, and she runs. She hides in a dark room, but finds her pursuer is near her and wielding a weapon. Turns out, it is just a doctor. Carol keeps running and bursts into a room where she finds dogs strung up and vivisected. Their guts splayed out as they quiver and make noises. Animals mutilated. Dogs. But I will upgrade this to killed because these dogs on the side are not moving. 5 points. She passes out again. The scene fades to Frank seeing Carol in bed at the sanatorium hospital. The clinic director at St. Paul's apologizes and says the one who left that door unlocked will be punished, but asks if Carol could just be less curious during her stay. She says that she was chased, but he said it was only one of the nurses who gave her a fright. Typical 1970s Italian misogyny, woman is gaslit, 4 points. She asserts it is true that a man chased her, but he says it must just be hallucinations. She continues to claim that she didn't make it all up, but the room is steadfast that she hallucinated the same man from her dream. Cut to the photographs taken of Frank and Deborah as Edmund presses him for answers about his affair. L is for lies for Frank lying about his affair earlier, 5 points. Frank continues to dodge the question. Edmund presses him to answer how long, and he says 2 years. Edmund then questions Frank about the phone call he'd received before the murder in which he had asked Frank if he was being unfaithful. He tells Frank to suppose the caller was Julia Derrere blackmailing him. Frank denies he has ever been blackmailed. Edmund then blackmails Frank for having a motive to kill Julia and to blame it on his wife. Frank points out Carol's dream and that if she didn't commit the murder, then she would have dream telepathy. Edmund reveals that Dr. Kerr gave him the tapes from the session so he could build a defense, and he plays a part where Dr. Kerr mentions that Carol keeps records of her dreams. Edmund questions Frank on Carol's dream journals, to which he denies this, but Edmund asserts that he knew, and so did Joan and Deborah, and that he could have perused these entries in order to stage his murder accordingly. Extra points for I is for infidelity for an act of blackmail occurring after the fact, another 5 points. Cut to the crime scene where Corvin, Edmund, Brandon, and Frank are discussing the supposed sequence of the murder. The killer would have entered the room through the landing and brought in several of the items, and would have put the boots on Julia because she was wearing them in Carol's dream. Frank is unable to speak out against the frame as it happens right in front of him. Frank then recites this theory aloud, that the killer came over with all these items, killed Julia, left the paper knife, the coat, the scarf, and put the boots on the victim. He asks whether Corvin believes all these details were written down in Carol's dream notes. Edmund asserts that Frank should ask Carol where she wrote them, unless he had written them himself. Cut to Frank searching for the dream notes as he talks with Joan. She mentions that often Carol would rip them up after a few days. She also admits to reading them a few times. Joan asks her father what the matter is, and he confesses to her that he is now the prime suspect and that he must find Carol's dream entries to try to clear his name. We cut to Carol being let out of the sanitarium due to these updates in the investigation. Carol is brought to her father's home, where she goes horseback riding. While riding, she notices the female hippie from her dream. The hippie tells Carol that she didn't kill Julia, but to meet her at 4 o'clock at the Wyndham Street Catholic Church with 20 quid. We briefly see Joan riding a motorcycle. The location for the meeting is actually the Alexandra Palace. Carol arrives and goes inside. The door slams shut behind her, and she is trapped inside. Carol searches for a way out. She runs through the basement and hides as she notices a man searching for her with a blade. The anxiety causes Carol to tear into her own flesh. The cat and mouse game continues. Carol finds an opening and takes it. The chase is on. They run up this massive spiral staircase and into this abandoned chapel. First person POV, 5 points. Carol finds a hiding place behind the organ. The man enters the chapel. From within, she watches as the man looks around, then turns to leave. Overcome with relief, Carol relaxes and accidentally sets off the electric organ. Sound erupts throughout the chapel. The man runs to the organ and into the opening Carol had taken refuge inside. He chases Carol upstairs. She takes a moment to hide on this level and catch her breath. Carol slides down the hall and slips into this room. She latches the door and bumps around in the darkness. As she searches for a way out, she finds a dead bat, and her shrieks cause a camp of bats to fly out of hiding and further terrify her. Extra points for Y is for yelling for a hysterical woman, another 5 points. The sound attracts the man who bangs on the door. The bats fly around and a few get caught in Carol's hair. She catches one and throws it to the ground. We will be having full points for bat effects later, ladies and gentlemen. The whole scene goes on a tad long as the lock is almost broken through and Carol crawls out of the room. Carol is trapped though and cannot break through. The man busts through the lock and grabs Carol. She manages to remove his helmet, revealing him to be the male hippie. Just then, he manages to slash Carol with his blade. She escapes and locks him in behind her. A woman outmuscles a man, 15 points. U is for undercover, 5 points. She escapes onto the roof. Rooftop scene, extra for it being part of a chase, 7 points. As she ambles along, Carol is becoming weak from blood loss or just trauma. She passes out on the roof. Third time she's passed out, the man comes out onto the roof and approaches her to finish the job. Before he can finish, he is nearly shot by this good Samaritan with a rifle. He tosses the blade and runs away. Typical 1970s Italian misogyny, woman is saved by a man, 10 points. Police arrive on scene just as the man escapes. Cut to Joan as she arrives at this dilapidated building to meet with the other hippie. Her name is Jenny, and she tosses paint-covered knives at a canvas. Never mind that she does it with the help of wires. Joan says that she has a date, that a redhead told her to meet him here. Joan asks Jenny what she's doing. She says, painting. We watch as Edmund is dropped off. We pan over to Corvin and Brandon, who remark that the redhead is indeed a real person. Corvin tells Brandon to stop any and every redhead he finds. No excuses. There is this rather humorous exchange.
Good thing we're not in Ireland.
This is a year after England deployed troops into Ireland and a year before the Bloody Sunday shooting, also called the Bogside Massacre. Context is crazy. The two women continue their talk. Joan says she'll buy the painting if Jenny does that thing she asked her to do. Jenny says she'd entirely forgotten, but old redhead might remember. Joan pays Jenny 20 quid to know where the redhead is. The scene cuts to Joan calling her father Frank. She tells him that she has remembered something about Carol and she has to meet a man to get the proof to clear her father's name. He pleads with her to not go, to not meet the man, but she asserts that she has everything under control. The call is being listened to by Edmund, who hangs up the phone, shaken up by the ordeal. We then cut to a field where police have found the body of Joan, who has had her throat slashed. Her father is mortified. Corvin now interrogates Carol about the blackmail theory. She relays that it began with the phone call to her father. Corvin tells her that the blackmailer, Mrs. Smith, was in fact Julia Durer. He asks how she found out about it, and she says that her father had mentioned it. Edmund walks in, who seems concerned that they are talking without him being present. After all, he's not just her father, he is her lawyer. The redhead, Hubert, is being questioned. They ask how he had access into Alexandra Palace. They claim he bribed a man with £5 and a weekend with his girlfriend in order to obtain the keys to get inside. Hubert says the man hates him, but not because the two knew each other, but because he hates everybody because he is a hunchback and everyone knows that. If it's not too obvious, he is experiencing withdrawals. He asks for drugs in exchange for the truth. Corvin is now telling Edmund that the man killed Joan and tried to kill Carol, but he did not commit the murder of Julia Durer. Corvin goes on to say that only 2 people know who the murderer is. Julia Durer was killed by the person she was blackmailing, and that wasn't Frank. Edmund apologizes for putting police on the wrong path and exits. Brandon then asks Corvin how he knows that he's caught the killer, and he says he knows without a doubt, but only one thing is contradicting this. He asks to have Dr. Kerr at the Durer flat. In the Durer flat now, Corvin is interrogating the hippies. Hubert tells police how Carol and Joan had followed them to the old theater, but only Joan had approached them. They tell Joan that they haven't been by Julia's for a couple weeks, and after a little back and forth, Joan learns that this was the night of the storm, of the murder. The hippies don't remember much of anything because they were on huge amounts of LSD. Jenny says that right now, on acid, all she can see in the inspector's place is a red blob or a galloping horse. He asks them what they saw that night, and Hubert says he remembers seeing a lizard in a woman's skin. Corvin asks them if they climbed up onto the balcony. They say they might have, then ask to be unshackled. The handcuffs are removed and they confess that they left the next morning and had no idea that Julia had been murdered until days later they'd heard. Hubert admits that they could have killed Julia and just not remembered, and that they had messed up by telling Joan that they were at Julia's flat the night of the murder. They thought they were going to be brought in and questioned, and so they tried to kill the only ones who knew they were there, Carol and Joan. Corvin tells Frank that Joan was killed by the 2 hippies because she was convinced that their presence would exonerate him, and that if the hippies were here the night of the murder as Carol had dreamed, then Julia Durer could not have been killed the next day by someone who had read the note. He states that they had given Julia the new boots. Hubert admits to this. Corvin then asks Dr. Kerr if it is possible to lie on the psychoanalytic couch, if it's possible that Carol had made up the lie to cover up for someone. The phone rings for Corvin. It is Brandon. Cut to the dead body of Edmund Brighton, who lies motionless with a pistol beside him and a gunshot wound at his temple. There is a note he has signed confessing to the murder of Julia Durer. Brandon tells Corvin over the phone of these details and his assumption that the inquiry can be closed. We find Carol at her father's grave. Corvin walks up and expresses his admiration he had towards her father. Carol acts confused, and Corvin tells her that they both know why he did it. Strap in, folks. All right, let's go. Corvin reminds Carol of when he came to speak of her last and asked her about the blackmailer, and her father had walked in. She remembers, of course. He says that her father didn't tell her about the blackmail. He knows who it was. Mrs. Smith, aka Julia Durer. Carol denies this. Corvin says he has proof. Her sessions with Dr. Kerr. We are reminded of when Corvin asked Dr. Kerr if it is possible for a patient to come in for psychoanalysis and lie. Corvin goes on to state that Carol had real-world drama with Julia Durer, and because no one knew about their relationship, she believed she would get away with murder, and she went to Julia's that night expecting her to be alone. Only after the murder did Carol notice the 2 hippies, and she had fled the scene, her scarf getting caught on Julia's body. Corvin reveals to Carol that the hippies were so riddled with acid that night that they were in essence blind witnesses. In Carol's logic, the hippies maybe didn't know her, but they could have accused her later, and so she came up with her alibi. Corvin admits that her alibi could have gotten her off due to a schizophrenic episode, and that's why she invented the dream. So the seeds for her alibi could be planted. A is for alibi, extra for it getting investigated, 10 points. Extra points for L is for lies, for someone lying about their alibi, add 5 more points. Corvin drops the bombshell that the blackmail phone call from Julia Durer was about Carol herself. She had a secret affair going on with Julia. We watch the phone call now from Julia's side, and we can see Carol there with her. After sufficient time, Carol hangs up the phone and says she will pay Julia. Corvin says how Edmund refused to believe that his daughter could have committed murder, which was why he was against the insanity plea and why he sought an alternative explanation behind the events. But both he and Corvin had solved the murder in the same moment. Corvin tells Carol that she had committed murder in full consciousness, and this reality is why her father decided to end things. With those final words, Corvin leads Carol into the back of a police car and they leave. The camera pans out over the river as the credits roll and the film ends. Let me add up some final tallies. Hidden identity of the killer until the final moments, 5 points. From earlier, pathology forensics to solve, referring to the footprints, 3 points. I'll give mistaken identity of the killer to Frank, 5 points. S is for secrets, extra for the killer having an impossible to predict motive, 10 points. And O is for obsession, extra for the killer being obsessed, 10 points. I'll also say that despite being a bit generous with a few of the cliches, there were several more which I justified as not being sufficient enough to warrant adding them. For example, I could have given the hippies witness misremembers something, but decided not to because that is what they remember. I digress. And that's A Lizard in a Woman's Skin. I like this movie. I always have. It has been a long time, so I didn't remember a lot of the classical soft-boiled mystery plot, but I remembered the ending in the graveyard where the murder is finally solved. The visuals of the 2 dream sequences are what always stood out to me, plus the scene of the disemboweled dogs. I think it is so fascinating that back in the day, Lucio Fulci, the guy who had come to be associated with excess in the Italian horror and giallo film genres, would begin with the most logically planned out and well-constructed giallo stories, albeit full of nudity, referring to this movie and Perversion Story. As time goes on, though, they begin to be, how do I put it, less genius, but in the late 60s and early 70s, he was competing with the originators, and near the end of the 70s, the genre would have seen more than 200 giallo films, and I think that maybe he was fed up with the lazier stories getting as much, if not more, praise than his much smarter scripts. A Lizard in a Woman's Skin is classic Fulci, classic Italian horror, and classic giallo. If you haven't seen it yet, do yourself a favor and check it out. Quintessential giallo. Let's segue to the GialliTally cliches for this movie. Post-giallo viewing cliches. The reason for the killing. I am very open to the possibilities on this one. I initially would say blackmail as the motive, but Carol isn't blackmailing. She's retaliating against blackmail, so revenge. But I'll also go along with psychopathy or obsession, which both categories are the same, 7 points. The reason for the investigation, police investigator, 2 points. Now, Frank does do his own investigation to clear his name, but this is considerably short in the plot, and we actually follow the investigators around a whole lot. Plus, they solve it. Bonus points. The style bonus. The movie has zooms, crash zooms, focus rack fades, there's a POV or two, slow motion use, mirror shots, crazy stuttering from the editing, and the dream sequences overall are just breathtaking. Out of a max total of 25 points, I will give A Lizard in a Woman's Skin 23 points for its style bonus. Soundtrack. Oh, indeed, 15 points. Bad effects? Those damned bats, yes. Between 10 and 15, I'll give the movie 12 points for bad effects. The prop bats are considerably better than those from later gialli. Also, the dog puppets were so good that Fulci was arrested and the crew had to testify in court that they were not real. And even when the actual puppets were brought in, the court considered if this was just a trick. So the effects are pretty good. I can't give full points for them being bad. Final look, extra points. The Deadpool tallying how many kills and deaths are featured in the film. I break it down as thus: 10 points per kill or death scene for the main Deadpool, plus any stylistic kill multipliers, which we didn't add yet, plus the knife kill bonus. We have Julia Durer stabbed with a knife, impaled, 21 points. Joan Hammond, throat slit. We technically do not see the kill, so we don't see a knife, but 17 points. And Edmund Brighton, gunshot, 10 points. Extended Deadpool for those other deaths mentioned but not seen, I'll give 3 points for each. There's none. Red herrings for the total number of legitimate suspects in the film. 5 points per legit suspect are awarded. In my opinion, we have Carol Hammond, Frank Hammond, Edmund Brighton, Deborah, Joan Hammond, Jenny, Hubert, and I'll say Dr. Care. 40 points for red herrings. Flashback sequences, 5 points each. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7, for a total of 35 points for flashbacks. Nudity, I award 5 points for ass, 7 for breasts, and 10 for genitalia. Strap in. We have ass, 5 points. Julia Durer, breasts, 7 points. Carol, ass and breasts, 12 points. Breasts and ass, 12 points. Breasts, 7 points. Breasts, 7 points. Breasts and ass, 12 points. Ass, 5 points. Breasts, 7 points. Breasts, 7 points. Breasts, 7 points. Ass and breasts, 12 points. Julia Durer, breasts, 7 points. Carol, ass, then breasts, then full frontal, 22 points. Breasts, 7 points. Breasts, 7 points. Breasts, 7 points. Breasts, 7 points. Ass, 5 points. And breasts, 7 points. For a total of 169 points for nudity. Ladies and gentlemen, for A Lizard in a Woman's Skin, I awarded the film an AZ score of 17 out of 26. With the bonus points for these, we have a modified score total of 150 points. And for the full GialliTally score, I award A Lizard in a Woman's Skin a GialliTally score of 762 points. Well, damn, 750 plus. Compared to The Strange Vice of Mrs. Ward with 728 points, A Lizard in a Woman's Skin is the new GialliTally lead with 762 points, putting A Quiet Place to Kill in third with 579 points, and Perversion Story is now out of the top 3 with 571 points. I predicted that the movie would end up getting around 600, and I really thought I was finally overdoing the prediction. I wasn't sure how long it would take before we had another giallo break past 600 and 700, but it didn't take long at all, in fact. The nudity extra points could be said are the main determinant of a giallo's position in the GialliTally, but like I've stated before, these points don't mean a movie is better or worse. Please like this video, share it with your friends if they are horror fans or cinephiles, subscribe to The King in Giallo if you haven't yet, and if you have any questions, thoughts, curiosities, or concerns, leave those below in the comment section and I will get back to you. Give The King in Giallo a follow on Instagram and a like on Facebook. Subscribe to the King in Giallo Patreon to see early access to my videos, with some videos able to be seen up to 3 weeks in advance before they go on YouTube. Plus, exclusive content found only there, such as the viewings, and very soon there will be podcasts, let's plays for Giallo-inspired games, and book reviews for Giallo-inspired books. This year, there will be a whole lot of new content. If you subscribe to me there on Patreon, I will have direct conversations with you, and I appreciate your feedback and want to know what types of content you would like for me to produce. Next time on The King in Giallo will be the Forgotten Giallo film series, episode 17, 1971 part 1, and then the overview, review, and GialliTally for The Fourth Victim, starring Carol Baker. Thank you very much for your continued support. This is Tanner Leeser for The King in Giallo, and if nothing else, I'll see you next time.
Don't let anyone slip through. Not even if it's the Prince of Wales, right?
Okay, sir. Good thing we're not in Ireland.